There is a particular kind of silence that does not belong to peace. It is not the silence of a sleeping house, or the silence of a winter morning after snow. It is the silence of a man sitting at a table with his hands in his lap, staring at a wall that no longer interests him, breathing so quietly and so steadily that you sometimes need to watch his chest just to confirm that he is still alive. That is the silence that entered the Aldren household in the spring of 1919, and that is the silence we are here to examine tonight. Wherever you are watching this, whatever city, whatever room, whatever hour of the night, take a moment and consider what it would mean to share a home with that silence, to pass it in the hallway every morning, to set a plate in front of it, to say goodnight to it and receive nothing in return. We are going to go slowly tonight. This story deserves that. It asks for patience, and it rewards it. Begin, if you will, in Harwick Falls, Ohio. The year is 1914. Not yet the year of catastrophe. That comes later, but already a town that carries within it a kind of quiet premonition, the way certain mornings in late October carry the smell of winter before any cold has actually arrived. Harwick Falls sits in the northeastern corner of the state, tucked against a bend in the Black River, where the water slows and darkens. The town was incorporated in 1851, built on a foundation of small industry, a mill, a tannery, a modest ironworks, and by 1914 it had grown to a population of just under 4,000 people, which was neither small enough to feel intimate nor large enough to feel anonymous. Everyone in Harwick Falls knew a version of everyone else. They knew which families attended the Lutheran church and which attended the Methodist. They knew which farms were failing and which were solvent. They knew, with a precision that could sometimes be cruel, where each person stood within the unwritten architecture of social life. Main Street ran east to west along a gentle slope, lined on both sides with two-story brick buildings that housed the hardware store, the pharmacy, the dry goods merchant, the lawyer's office, and the offices of the Harwick Falls Courier, a weekly newspaper that had been in continuous publication since 1878. The sidewalks were wooden in the older sections near the river and replaced with poured concrete further toward the newer residential neighborhoods that had been platted in the 1890s. In summer, the whole town smelled of river mud and freshly cut grass, and the particular sweetness of coal smoke from the ironworks mixing with the cooler air that came down from the hills to the north. In winter it was grey and still, and the river would ice over most years from December through late February, and the sound of the ice cracking in the thaw was something the older residents described as a kind of annual announcement, a signal that the world was returning to motion. It was into this world that Thomas Aldren had been born in November of 1893. He was the second son of Harold Aldren, who ran the hardware store on Main Street, and Martha Aldren, née Greer, whose family had farmed the same 40 acres north of town since before the Civil War. Thomas grew up working in the store on Saturdays, counting nails and stacking tins of paint, learning the names of tools and the weights of different grades of wire. He attended Harwick Falls Grammar School and then the county high school, where he was remembered by his teachers as attentive and quietly curious, not the loudest student in any room, not the most aggressive competitor on the school's small baseball team, but possessed of a steadiness that people would later reach for the right word to describe and usually settle on the word reliable. He was not extraordinary. That is worth saying plainly, because it matters to this story. Thomas Aldren was not a remarkable young man in any way that would have distinguished him from dozens of other young men in Harwick Falls or in any of the hundreds of towns like Harwick Falls scattered across the American Midwest in the years before the war. He liked fishing. He read the newspaper. He was fond of his mother. He courted in a slow and careful way that was typical of his general temperament a girl named Eleanor Marsh, whose father owned the pharmacy and who had a reputation in town for being sensible and good-humored, which was considered a fine combination in a young woman of that era and that place. By the summer of 1914, Thomas was 20 years old and working full-time at the hardware store. He and Eleanor had been walking out together for nearly a year. There was a general understanding in town, the kind of understanding that does not require announcement, that they would eventually marry. Harold Aldren had already spoken in vague terms about the possibility of Thomas taking over the store one day. This is the life that the war interrupted. The war arrived in Europe in August of 1914, which was, to most of Howick Falls, an event of considerable interest and very little personal relevance. Europe was far away. The United States was not involved. President Wilson was emphatic on the subject of neutrality. The Howick Falls Courier covered the early campaigns with the same mix of fascination and detachment it might have given to a major flood in a distant river valley. Terrible, significant, not immediately one's concern. But the war did not go away. It expanded. It deepened. It ate through the assumptions of everyone who had expected it to resolve itself within months, as previous European conflicts had done. By 1915, the articles in the Courier grew longer and more detailed. By 1916, the tone had shifted in a way that was difficult to name precisely, but was nonetheless palpable. A slight narrowing of the distance between the news from France and the daily life of a town in northeastern Ohio. Thomas followed it all carefully. He kept a map of the Western Front, the kind sold at the pharmacy, printed on thin paper, tacked to the wall of his room above the hardware store. He moved small pins along the line as he read about the advances and retreats. He discussed the campaigns with his father in the evenings and with Eleanor on their Sunday walks. There was no urgency in these discussions. There was no fear. It was more like the way one follows a long and complicated story, with genuine interest but from a safe distance. The way you might lean forward over a map of a country you have never visited and trace the roads with your finger without any real intention of traveling them. America entered the war in April of 1917. Thomas Aldren enlisted in June, 6 weeks after the declaration. He was 23 years old. He enlisted at the recruitment office that had been established in the old post office building on 2nd Street, and he signed his name in a register that the recruiting sergeant said was already filling up fast. There were 4 other young men from Howick Falls in line ahead of him that morning. 2 of them he had known since grammar school. The send-off, in August of 1917, was what such send-offs always were. The combination of pride and terror that communities have always constructed around the departure of their young men to war, the brass band, the flags, the mothers who kept their expressions controlled until the moment the train actually began to move, and then did not. Eleanor Marsh stood on the platform and held Thomas's hands for a long time without saying much. He told her he would write. He told her he would be careful. These were the things you said. The train pulled away from the station at 11:14 in the morning, and Thomas Aldren leaned out the window to watch Howick Falls recede until the curve of the track took it from view. He was gone for 14 months. In that time, he wrote 47 letters home. The letters to his parents were returned and preserved. The letters to Eleanor Marsh were not, or if they were, they have not survived in any accessible collection. The 47 surviving letters, held today in a small archive at the Howick County Historical Society, represent, in the view of anyone who has read them, an unremarkable correspondence. They describe food, weather, the quality of the mud, the names of men he had befriended. They ask after the store. They ask after Eleanor. They mention in passing and without elaboration that things are difficult, that they have seen hard times, that it has been a rough stretch. They do not describe combat. They do not describe death. Either Thomas Aldren was a naturally reticent correspondent, or he had made a conscious decision about what to include and what to withhold, or the censors had removed more than we can now verify. The 47th letter, dated September 3rd, 1918, arrived in Howick Falls on September 21st. It was 3 sentences long. It said that Thomas was well. It said he hoped everyone at home was well. It said he looked forward to seeing them soon. 6 days after that letter was postmarked, Thomas Aldren was found. The circumstances of what happened in those intervening days are not entirely clear, and they are not clear because the records that would clarify them are incomplete in ways that later became a subject of some speculation. What the military documentation shows, the records that have been released and that researchers have been able to examine, is that on September 7, 1918, Private Thomas Aldren was reported missing during an engagement near the Argonne Forest, in a section of the front that was in the middle of what would become known as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, one of the largest and most costly operations in American military history. His name was entered in the Missing Persons Registry. Notification was prepared for his family. Then, on September 9th, 2 days after he was reported missing, Thomas Aldren was found. He was found approximately 4 kilometers behind the front line by a French farmer named Georges Vautrin, who was attempting to assess damage to his property in the early hours of the morning. Vautrin later gave a statement to the American military authorities, and a translated summary of that statement survives in the archive. According to Vautrin, he found Thomas seated in the remains of a stone barn, the roof of which had been partially collapsed by shell damage at some earlier point in the campaign. Thomas was seated with his back against the interior stone wall, his rifle beside him, his pack still on his back. He was conscious. His eyes were open. He did not respond when Vautrin spoke to him in French. He did not respond when Vautrin attempted, in Vautrin's words, the few English words at his disposal. He was not physically injured. That is one of the first things the medical examination established when Thomas was returned to American lines. No wounds, no fever. His vital signs were, by the records, entirely within normal parameters. He was described as cooperative in the physical examination, meaning he did not resist being examined. But he did not speak a word throughout the entire process. He did not speak when asked his name. He did not speak when asked the name of his unit. He did not speak when asked, in the careful and slightly hopeful way of a military physician who knows the answer but asks anyway, whether he could tell them what had happened. He simply sat and looked and breathed. The diagnosis entered into his record was shell shock, which in 1918 was still a relatively recent and deeply contested clinical category. The term had been introduced early in the war by the British medical establishment to describe a constellation of symptoms: tremors, paralysis, sensory loss, extreme psychological withdrawal, that were appearing in combat soldiers in numbers that no one had anticipated and for which existing medical frameworks had no adequate explanation. In 1918, there were two primary schools of thought about what shell shock actually was. The first, advanced by physicians with a neurological orientation, held that it was a physical injury, that the concussive force of nearby explosions was causing microscopic damage to the nervous system, damage that conventional examination could not detect. The second, advanced by physicians with a more psychological orientation, held that it was a psychiatric condition, that the mind, confronted with experiences too extreme to process or integrate, was essentially shutting down certain functions as a protective mechanism, the way a circuit breaker cuts power to prevent a fire. Thomas Aldren's case was assigned to the second category, though the assignment was made with less certainty than the paperwork suggests. The physician who examined him, a Dr. Raymond Stowell of Chicago, noted in his report, and this is a direct transcription from the archive, that the patient presented with complete voluntary mutism with preserved comprehension, meaning that Thomas gave every indication of understanding what was said to him, responding with eye movement and posture shifts to direct address, but was entirely unable or unwilling to produce speech. Stowell noted that this pattern was distinct from aphasia, the neurological condition that destroys the capacity for language. Thomas could read. He demonstrated this during the examination when shown written questions, to which he responded with small, definitive nods or shakes of his head. His silence, Stowell concluded, was not neurological in origin. What it was in origin, Stowell declined to specify with any confidence. Thomas was transported to a military hospital in Paris in late September 1918. He remained there for 6 weeks. In that time, he was seen by 2 additional physicians and by a chaplain, none of whom produced any change in his condition. He ate. He slept. though his sleep was described by the nursing staff as unusually light and frequently interrupted, and he was noted to spend hours sitting up in the darkness of the ward in the early morning, apparently awake, apparently alert, apparently listening to something that the nurses could not identify. He bathed, he dressed himself, he followed instruction. He moved through the routines of the hospital ward with a compliance that several staff members described, independently of one another, as unnerving. Not because it suggested aggression or instability, but because it suggested the opposite, an absence of resistance so complete that it felt to those around him like something other than mere passivity. One nurse, a woman from Lyon named Colette Renard, whose memoirs were published privately in 1947 and who included in those memoirs a brief but detailed account of Thomas Aldren without using his name, described the experience of tending to him as like caring for a man who has decided to be furniture. Not unhappy furniture, not angry furniture, simply furniture that has chosen to remain very still until the world changes into something it recognizes. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Thomas Aldren came home to Harwich Falls on March 14, 1919. The journey from France had taken nearly 4 months to arrange, which was not unusual in the chaotic demobilization of the American Expeditionary Forces, but which felt, to his family, like an additional trial added to a trial already beyond comprehension. Harold and Martha Aldren had been notified of Thomas's condition in October of 1918. A letter from the army, formal in tone and limited in detail, informing them that their son was in hospital in France, following a period of exposure to combat conditions, and that he had experienced a disruption of speech function, but was in otherwise satisfactory physical health. The phrase, disruption of speech function, was not explained. Martha Aldren later told a neighbor that she had read that phrase perhaps 100 times over the following months, and had never been able to decide whether it frightened her or reassured her more. The station in Harwich Falls was smaller and quieter on the morning Thomas returned than it had been on the morning he left. It was a Thursday. The weather was cold and overcast, with a thin, penetrating wind coming off the river. Harold and Martha were there. Eleanor Marsh was there. Thomas's older brother Francis, who had not enlisted due to a congenital problem with his left knee, was there. There were perhaps a dozen other people, friends and neighbors, none of whom had been specifically asked to come, but who had, in the way of small towns, simply known. The train arrived at 11 minutes past 9 in the morning. Thomas stepped off the car onto the platform and stood still for a moment, in a way that might have looked, to someone watching from a distance, like a man simply getting his bearings after a long journey. He was wearing his uniform. He looked, physically, almost identical to the young man who had boarded this same train 19 months earlier. Perhaps slightly thinner, perhaps holding himself in a way that was fractionally different, a slight forward lean in the shoulders that had not been there before, but recognizable, entirely recognizable. Martha Aldren crossed the platform and embraced her son, and Thomas allowed the embrace. He did not return it exactly, and his arms came up slowly and rested against his mother's back without pressure. But he did not resist it, and he turned his face toward her hair, and he remained in the embrace for a long time. Harold Aldren shook his son's hand and then pulled him close, and Thomas received that as well, with the same quality of passive acceptance. Francis put a hand on his brother's shoulder and said his name, and Thomas looked at him with those still, clear eyes that everyone at the station that morning would spend years trying to describe to people who had not been there. Eleanor Marsh stood slightly back from the family. She had been standing with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression controlled with visible effort. When Thomas had finished with his family, he turned and looked at her, and she looked at him. And there was a long moment that no one who witnessed it ever fully described, and everyone who witnessed it remembered for the rest of their lives. Then Thomas walked to her and stood close to her without touching her, and she took one of his hands in both of hers, and he let her, and she said his name, and he looked at her, and he said nothing. He would say nothing for a very long time. The Aldrens brought Thomas home to the house above the hardware store where he had grown up. His room had been prepared for him. The same map of the Western Front was still tacked to the wall, the pins still in the positions they had occupied when he left. Martha had left it there because she did not know what else to do with it, and later she said she could not stand to look at it, but equally could not make herself take it down. Thomas, when he first entered his room and saw the map, stopped in the doorway and looked at it for a considerable amount of time. Then he walked to it and removed every pin one by one and placed them in a small glass jar on the dresser. Then he sat on the edge of his bed and folded his hands in his lap and was silent. The first weeks at home established what would become the essential pattern of Thomas Aldren's life for years to come. He woke early, always before the rest of the household, always before dawn, and sat in whatever room he had chosen for the night's vigil, usually the kitchen, sometimes the small back parlor. He ate what was put in front of him. He moved through the house without disturbing anything. He would go outside and stand in the narrow alley behind the hardware store, sometimes for an hour or more, looking at the sky. He appeared, in all observable respects, to be entirely present in his body and entirely functional in his basic capacities. He simply did not speak. Dr. Emmett Pryor, who had been the Aldren family's physician since Thomas was a child, examined him twice in the first month of his return. Pryor was a practical man, trained at Case Western Reserve in the 1890s, more comfortable with visible injury than with the territory Thomas represented. He found nothing physically wrong. He recorded his assessment in 2 short paragraphs that concluded with the statement that Thomas appeared to be in fair health, and that the mutism was likely of nervous origin and might resolve in time with the comfort of familiar surroundings. This assessment reflected both the limits of Pryor's training and the limits of available clinical knowledge in 1919. It was not wrong, exactly, but it was not helpful in any way that the family could measure. Harwick Falls received Thomas's silence in stages. The first stage was sympathy, which was genuine and expressed in the conventional forms of the time: food delivered, offers of assistance made, careful and considerate avoidance of direct inquiry about the obvious. The town understood, or believed it understood, that the war had damaged Thomas in some way, and the town extended to him and to his family the same basic courtesy it extended to any household managing a significant difficulty. People spoke of him in hushed tones. They called his condition "what happened to Thomas" without specifying what that was. They brought him into conversations as an example of the terrible cost of the war, and they did so with evident feeling. The second stage was discomfort, which developed more slowly but proved more durable. Thomas began by late spring of 1919 to appear in public. He would walk the streets of Harwick Falls in the mornings, moving at a deliberate pace along familiar routes, down Main Street, over the bridge, along the river path, back through the residential streets to the house. He would stop in the hardware store and stand behind the counter for hours, as he had done as a boy, watching the customers come in. He did not assist them. He simply watched. Harold Aldren would conduct business with Thomas 3 feet behind him, and the customers who came in for nails or paint or wire found themselves in the peculiar position of being observed by a young man in a faded military coat, who gave no indication of either interest or disinterest, who simply looked at them with that steady, clear gaze that communicated nothing, and somehow, precisely because it communicated nothing, managed to communicate something that no one could name. Children in the neighborhood were the most honest about their response. They avoided Thomas, not because they had been told to, but because they sensed something in him that their instincts flagged as requiring distance. Not danger, not malevolence. Something quieter and stranger than either of those. His neighbor's daughter, a girl of 7 named Hattie Bowman, was asked by her mother why she no longer played near the alley behind the hardware store, which had previously been one of her favorite routes between streets. Hattie said, according to her mother's account, because Mr. Thomas watches the sky different. When pressed on what she meant, she could not explain further. She said it again: he watches it different, and would not elaborate. Eleanor Marsh continued to visit. This is one of the more significant and more painful threads in the story of Thomas Aldren's return, and it deserves careful attention. Eleanor had waited through the war. She had written letters that Thomas had presumably received, though there is no evidence in the form of replies that he had responded to any of them after the one letter he sent in September of 1918. She had received the Army's notification of his condition and had managed, in the 14 months between his going missing and his coming home, to build within herself a picture of what he might be like when he returned and how she might help him recover. The reality was harder than any picture. Eleanor came to the Aldren house 3 times a week in the first months after Thomas's return. She would sit with him in the parlor or on the small porch at the back of the house, and she would talk to him about ordinary things, about the pharmacy, about mutual acquaintances, about small news from the courier. And Thomas would sit near her and listen, or appear to listen in his characteristic way, with that absolute stillness and those unreadable eyes. Occasionally he would look at her directly when she spoke, and Eleanor later told her sister that those moments were simultaneously the most precious and the most devastating, that there was, when his eyes settled on her face, an unmistakable quality of recognition of something that was not absent, and that this recognition was worse in some ways than blankness would have been, because it meant that someone was in there, fully in there, and was simply choosing, or was unable to stop choosing, not to come out. She brought him small gifts, a book, a carved wooden box she had found at the dry goods merchant, a pressed flower from her mother's garden. Thomas accepted all of these with the same quality of passive receiving, and Eleanor would arrange them on his windowsill or dresser, and he would look at them without touching them. And when she came back the following week, they would be in exactly the same positions. She stopped visiting in November of 1919, 8 months after his return. The decision was not announced. She simply came less frequently and then stopped. She married a man named Robert Calhoun in 1921, a recently arrived accountant from Columbus who worked for the bank on 2nd Street. The wedding was attended by most of Harwick Falls. Thomas Aldren did not attend. Whether Thomas registered Eleanor's marriage or registered her absence before it is not something the record allows us to establish, but it is worth noting because several of the people who knew Thomas in that period noted it themselves, that in the weeks following Eleanor's wedding, Thomas's behavior underwent a subtle but distinct change. He began spending less time in the hardware store and more time in his room. The morning walks became less regular. Martha Aldren told a neighbor that Thomas had begun, in the evenings, to sit at the kitchen table and draw in a composition notebook, small, precise drawings of things she could not always identify. She did not look at the notebook closely, she said, because it felt like an intrusion, but she glimpsed the pages sometimes when she came in to set the table for supper, and what she saw, she told her neighbor, were not pictures of anything from around here. Fact 1 in the sequence of documentation. Thomas Aldren's silence was total from the moment of his discovery in the French barn on September 9, 1918, through the end of his life. There is not a single verified account of him speaking after that date, not a word to his parents, not a syllable to the physicians who examined him, not a sound heard by any neighbor, any acquaintance, any stranger. The silence was not selective. It was not directed at particular people or reserved for particular situations. It was, as far as anyone could determine across a period of decades, absolute and unchanging. Fact 2. Thomas was, by multiple accounts, not deaf. This seems almost too obvious to state, but it becomes important in the context of later theories about his condition. He responded to sound in all the normal physical ways. He turned toward unexpected noises. He flinched at a dropped pan in the kitchen. He showed the small but measurable postural reactions of a person whose auditory system is processing environmental information. He could not have been simulating this. The responses were involuntary and consistent across too many years and too many observers to be deliberate performance. Fact 3. He could read and write. We established that during the military examination, but it bears emphasis because the family, and later researchers, tried to use this capacity as a route around the silence. Notes were passed to Thomas throughout his life, questions written on paper, requests, conversational gambits, and Thomas always read them. His eyes moved across the text in the normal pattern of reading. He understood what he read. but he never wrote a response. Not once in the decades of his silence did he pick up a pen and write down a single word in reply to anything that was asked of him. This is the detail that distinguishes Thomas Aldren's case from many other documented cases of post-combat mutism, and that makes it, in the view of those who have studied it, genuinely unusual. Most cases of elective or trauma-induced mutism involve a specific channel of communication being blocked, while others remain accessible. Many mute soldiers wrote extensively. Many communicated through gesture or through the physical manipulation of objects in their environment. Thomas's silence was not merely verbal. It extended across every modality of communication except the most basic and involuntary: eye contact, postural response, facial micro-expression, and even those he modulated to a minimum over time. He was communicating nothing about his interior, deliberately, consistently, and across decades. Whatever he knew or remembered or carried within him, he had decided, or some part of him had decided, that it would not be transmitted. Fact 4. The records from the French barn contain an anomaly that was not noticed at the time but became significant later. When Georges Vautrin found Thomas on September 9th, he noted that Thomas had with him his rifle, his pack, and his canteen. The canteen was full. The military rations in his pack had not been touched. Vautrin estimated, based on the temperature of the food and other environmental factors, that Thomas had been in the barn for at least 1 full day, perhaps 2. If Thomas had been missing since September 7th and was found on the 9th, and if Vautrin's estimate was correct, this means that Thomas had spent perhaps 48 hours sitting in an abandoned barn within 4 kilometers of the front line, with food and water he had not consumed, in a state of what the military physicians would later describe as apparently voluntary immobility. The question of where Thomas was and what he was doing between the morning of September 7th, when he was reported missing, and the moment of his discovery is the central, unanswerable question of his story. There were no witnesses to place him anywhere between those 2 points. The movements of his unit during the Meuse-Argonne offensive were complex and not fully documented at the individual level. The fighting in that section of the front during those 2 days was intense. The Argonne Forest campaign involved some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the entire war, with German defensive positions dug into the densely wooded hillsides in configurations that made conventional assault tactics devastatingly costly. Thomas had been in the front line. He had been there when the offensive began. His unit suffered significant casualties in those opening days, and then he had walked, or been moved, or had drifted 4 kilometers behind the line and sat down in a barn and not moved for 2 days. Fact 5. Sometime during the summer of 1920, Harold Aldren found the composition notebook that Martha had mentioned and opened it. He did not tell Martha that he had done this until much later. She described his telling her in a conversation with her sister that the sister preserved in a letter, and what he described seeing in it was this: page after page of drawings, executed in a fine, precise hand, depicting the same landscape from multiple angles and with varying levels of detail. A hillside, densely wooded, a series of shallow depressions in the earth that might have been natural formations or might have been constructed. At the center of several of the drawings, rendered with particular care, was what appeared to be an entrance to a structure, either a dugout or a natural cave, it was impossible to say which, with no indication of what lay inside it. Harold Aldren closed the notebook and put it back where he had found it, and did not mention it to anyone except Martha, and to her only years later. He never told Thomas that he had seen it. The notebook disappeared at some point before Thomas's death, and has not been found. Fact 6. In the spring of 1921, a young physician named Dr. Lena Hartwell arrived in Harwick Falls. She was one of the first female physicians in that part of Ohio, trained at the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and she had come to Harwick Falls to take a position in the public health office that the county had established in response to the 1918 influenza epidemic. Dr. Hartwell had a clinical interest in what she called, in a paper she later published in a regional medical journal, the neurological and psychological after effects of extreme stress in returned servicemen. She had treated several cases of shell shock in Philadelphia and had developed, through her clinical experience and her reading of the emerging European literature on the subject, a set of practices that differed from the approaches common among her male colleagues. She asked to examine Thomas Aldren, and the family agreed. What she found, and what she documented in a clinical note that survives in a private archive, was consistent with what previous physicians had found, but she interpreted it differently. She described Thomas's mutism as purposive rather than symptomatic, a distinction that was unusual for the time and that she was careful to frame in clinical language that would not be read as accusatory. She meant not that Thomas was pretending or deceiving, but that his silence had, at some level of his psychology, become a function that he was actively maintaining, a structure he had built, or that had built itself, and that he was now inhabiting rather than simply suffering from. She wrote that she believed he had witnessed or experienced something that had become, for reasons internal to his psychology and beyond his voluntary control, entirely inexpressible. She did not speculate about what that something was. She noted that pressing him for information, through questions, through gestures, through the various approaches previous physicians had tried, was, in her assessment, precisely the wrong approach, because it treated the silence as a blockage to be removed rather than as a message to be read. She did not think the silence would resolve on its own. She thought it was permanent. She was right. Fact 7. In the autumn of 1922, Thomas Aldren began attending the Sunday evening services at the Methodist Church on Elm Street. No one had invited him. He simply appeared one Sunday evening in the back pew and sat through the service with his characteristic stillness and his characteristic gaze, directed at some point slightly above and beyond the minister's head. He returned every Sunday for 11 years, sitting in the same back pew, receiving communion with the others when it was offered. He would extend his hands and receive the wafer and the cup like everyone else, going through the physical forms of participation, and leaving immediately when the service concluded, before anyone had a chance to speak to him. The minister during those years, a Reverend Lewis Hobart, kept a diary, and his diary contains more than a dozen references to Thomas, always written with a mixture of pastoral concern and personal perplexity. He describes Thomas as a man who seems to be in the presence of something I cannot see, and to be conducting in the deepest silence a conversation I cannot hear. He writes that he tried on 3 separate occasions to speak to Thomas privately, and that in each case Thomas had looked at him with that direct, clear gaze that Hobart describes as simultaneously the most and least human thing I have ever encountered in 30 years of ministry. Hobart eventually stopped trying to make contact and accepted Thomas as a presence in his congregation the way you accept a particular stone or tree in a familiar landscape, as something that is simply there, that does not yield to inquiry, that has its own reasons. Fact 8. The military records pertaining to the 2 days of Thomas's disappearance contain a gap that was first noticed in 1956 by a researcher named Harold Peck, who was working on a history of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Peck wrote a brief note, which he included as a footnote in his larger work, that the daily action reports for Thomas's unit on September 7th and 8th were either lost or were never filed, and that this was unusual. The unit had maintained consistent daily reporting throughout the campaign, both before and after those 2 days, but those specific dates were absent from the record. Peck attributed this to the chaos of the offensive and the high casualty rate among officers who would normally have been responsible for maintaining records. He did not pursue it further. The absence, however, has been noted by others since. A gap of 2 days in a unit's records, precisely aligned with the 2 days during which one of its members went missing and then was found silent. This alignment may be entirely coincidental. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was genuinely chaotic. Records were genuinely lost. The casualty rate among junior officers responsible for record keeping was genuinely high. All of that is true, but the gap is there. Fact 9. Thomas never again looked at a map. This was something Martha Aldren told Dr. Hartwell, and Hartwell included it in her clinical notes. Maps of any kind, road maps, newspaper maps, the illustrated maps that appeared in books and magazines, caused Thomas to look away, or, if looking away was not possible without leaving the room, to close his eyes. Martha had removed the war map from his room herself, eventually, when she could no longer endure its presence, and Thomas had not acknowledged its absence. But she had observed over years that any map that appeared in the household, a road atlas Harold bought in 1924, a map printed in a National Geographic that Thomas had been given with a subscription, caused this same aversion. Not dramatic, not obviously distressed, just a quiet, deliberate refusal of the eyes to remain on the paper. Fact 10. There was a letter. This is the piece of evidence that arrived late, that reframed what people thought they understood, and that has never been fully explained. In 1931, 12 years after Thomas's return, a letter arrived at the Aldren house addressed to Thomas. It had been postmarked in Paris and was written in French, which none of the family could read. Harold Aldren took it to the high school principal, who had some French, and had it translated. The translation was never shared publicly, and what became of the original is not known, but Martha Aldren described its contents to her sister in a letter that her sister preserved, and from that second-hand description, the following can be reconstructed. The letter was from a man who identified himself as a French medical orderly who had worked in a field hospital near the Argonne during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He said that he had been thinking about Thomas for 12 years and had finally decided to write because his conscience would not give him peace. He said that he had been present when Thomas was brought into the field hospital on the evening of September 9th, 1918, before Thomas was transported to Paris. He said that in the field hospital, Thomas had spoken. He had spoken clearly and at length in what the orderly described as a voice of complete calm, almost without feeling, as if reading something from a document. He had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes, and the orderly's French had not been sufficient to understand everything, but he had understood that Thomas was describing a place, a specific location, a specific configuration of ground, something that was in or under a hillside, and that he was describing what he had found there. The orderly said he had told the supervising physician about Thomas's speech, and the physician had told him, in terms the orderly described as more firm than the situation seemed to require, that he was mistaken, that the patient had not spoken, and that he should not repeat the claim. The orderly had obeyed. For 12 years, he did not, in his letter, describe what Thomas had said he found. Martha Aldren's letter to her sister describes her own reaction to this translated letter in terms that are spare and carefully chosen, which is characteristic of her as a correspondent. She wrote that she had sat with the letter in the kitchen for a long time after reading it. She wrote that she had looked at Thomas, who was sitting across the table from her in his usual posture, and that she had placed the letter in front of him, and that he had looked at it, and that something in his face changed and then stopped changing, the way a candle will flare and then settle. He did not speak. He looked at the letter for a long time. Then he moved it to the side of the table with the same small, definitive motion he might have used to move a cup that was in his way. Martha wrote to her sister, "I think he has been waiting for someone to tell him that someone else knows. And now that someone has told him, he has decided it still makes no difference." Fact 11. Between 1919 and 1941, Thomas Aldren did not leave Harwick Falls. Not once. He was invited by his brother Francis, who moved to Cincinnati in 1923 to visit for Christmas. He was invited by his parents to accompany them on a train journey to see relatives in Pennsylvania. He declined all invitations, not through speech or writing, but through the physical fact of simply not going, not being at the train station, not being in the automobile. On one occasion, Harold Aldren had arranged for Thomas to come to the station to travel to Francis's wedding, had walked with him to the door of the taxi and watched him pause at the open door, stand there for a moment with one hand on the roof of the car, and then step back from it and return, at his usual measured pace, to the house. Harold Aldren stood at the taxi door for a while after that. Then he closed the door and went inside. Fact 12. Thomas Aldren had no medical crisis of any kind for the first 20 years of his silence. He was, by all physical measures, healthy. He maintained a steady weight. He slept, however, irregularly. He ate adequately. He walked daily. He was not deteriorating in any observable physical sense. Dr. Pryor, who examined him annually out of professional duty and perhaps out of personal curiosity, wrote in his notes each year a variation of the same sentence. Patient in fair health. No change in the presenting condition. He varied the wording slightly each year, which suggests a kind of editorial awareness of the redundancy, but the meaning remained identical. This consistency was in itself a notable feature of the case. Shell shock, as it was understood and as it presented in the majority of documented cases, was a condition that evolved over time, often toward greater instability, sometimes toward gradual and partial recovery, sometimes toward profound deterioration. Thomas's condition did neither. It simply persisted, like a steady state, like a system that had found its equilibrium and was content to remain there indefinitely. Fact 13. The town of Harwick Falls changed its relationship to Thomas Aldren over the 2 decades following his return in ways that are worth tracing carefully, because they illuminate something about the psychology of communities confronted with the inexplicable. In the first year, sympathy and careful solicitude. In the second and third years, growing discomfort and avoidance. In the fourth and fifth years, a kind of accommodation, the slow incorporation of Thomas's presence into the town's understanding of itself, the way a community will accommodate any persistent anomaly by eventually treating it as a feature of the landscape rather than a disruption of it. By the 1930s, Thomas Aldren was simply part of Harwick Falls in the way that the Black River was part of Harwick Falls, or the ironworks, or the Lutheran church on the hill. He was there. He had always been there, or felt that way to the younger residents who had grown up knowing him only as the silent man who walked the streets in the mornings and sat in the back pew on Sunday evenings. Children of the 1930s who were asked, in later life, what they remembered of Thomas, almost universally described not fear, but a kind of low-frequency solemnity, a sense that he carried something important and fragile, the way a person carries an open vessel of something that must not spill. Fact 14. In 1937, Martha Aldren died of pneumonia at the age of 68. Harold Aldren had predeceased her by 2 years. Their deaths left Thomas as the sole occupant of the house above the hardware store, which the family had sold to a buyer from Akron in 1933, when Harold's health made running the business impossible. Thomas remained in the residence above the former hardware store, now a dry goods annex, under a rental arrangement with the new owners that Francis Aldren managed from Cincinnati. After Martha's death, several neighbors made a point of checking on Thomas. One of them, a woman named Ruth Cavanaugh, who lived in the house directly behind the Aldren residence and who had known Thomas since childhood, described his behavior in the months following his mother's death as the same, but more. She meant, she explained, that all the qualities she had always observed in him were present in heightened form. The stillness, the steadiness, the quality of interior distance, and that she had the feeling, when she brought him food or looked in on him in the evenings, of something in him pressing more strongly against the inside of his silence, though it never broke through. She also noted, and this is perhaps the detail that lingers longest in any account of Thomas Aldren's later years, that after Martha's death, he began to sing, not aloud. His lips moved, sometimes, in the evenings when he was sitting by the window. She saw this from her kitchen window, through the narrow gap in the yards between their houses. His lips moved in what appeared to be the precise, controlled pattern of song, and no sound came out. She never told anyone about this while Thomas was alive, she said, because it seemed too private to share. After he died, she felt she had to mention it to someone, because it seemed too important to take with her unspoken to her own grave. She did not know what song it was. Fact 15. In 1941, Thomas Aldren left Harwick Falls for the first time in 22 years. He left in the middle of October, and he was gone for 11 days. He returned on a Thursday morning by bus, arriving at the Harwick Falls station at 7 in the morning. Ruth Kavanagh saw him coming up the street from her kitchen window and met him at his door. He looked, she said, like a man who had done what he went to do. She did not ask where he had been. She made him tea, which he accepted, and she sat across the table from him, and she watched him drink it in his usual way, small, precise sips, his eyes on the window, and she said she felt more strongly than she had ever felt it before, the thing she had always felt around him, which was that he understood something about the texture of the world that most people did not understand, and that this understanding was not a gift. When she asked him, later that day, by writing the question on a piece of paper and sliding it across the table to him, the first time in all their years of proximity that she had directly asked him anything, whether he was all right, he read the paper, and he looked at her, and he did something she had never seen him do in 22 years of knowing him as the silent man. He nodded. Where he had been for those 11 days in October of 1941 was not established during his lifetime, and has been the subject of considerable speculation since. Ship and train records are incomplete. No one in Harwick Falls knew he had left until he was gone. Francis Aldren, when contacted by Ruth Kavanagh after Thomas had been absent for 3 days, was apparently unsurprised in a way that Kavanagh found confusing. Francis said only that Thomas had mentioned in a recent letter Thomas communicated with his brother by mail, though what he wrote in these letters is unknown since Francis destroyed all his correspondence before his own death, that there was something he needed to see. Francis told Kavanagh that Thomas had said it was all right and that he would be back. He offered no further information. There are researchers who believe Thomas returned to France in those 11 days. The timing is possible. Transatlantic crossings were fast enough by 1941 to make a brief trip feasible, though crossing the Atlantic in October of 1941, with the war in Europe fully engaged and the United States 2 months from its own entry, would have required determined effort. There are others who believe he traveled to Washington, where several archives of military records from the First World War were housed, though no record of his presence there has been found. There are others still who believe the trip was domestic and mundane, a visit to a place or person connected to the war, perhaps a surviving member of his unit, perhaps a fellow patient from the Paris hospital. None of these theories has been confirmed. Fact 16. Thomas Aldren died on February 18, 1949. He was 55 years old. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. He died in his bed, in the house above the former hardware store, in the room where he had grown up and to which he had returned after the war, and in which he had spent the better part of 3 decades in absolute silence. Ruth Kavanagh found him in the morning when he failed to appear in the kitchen by his usual hour. He had placed, before he died, or perhaps in the days before he died, all of his personal effects in a careful arrangement on the dresser and the windowsill of his room. The carved wooden box that Eleanor Marsh had brought him was there, the glass jar of pins from the war map, a pocket watch that had been his father's, several river stones that he appeared to have collected over the years, smooth and grey and unremarkable, a single dried flower, which Ruth Kavanagh said appeared to be a flower pressed from a French variety she could not identify. There was no note. He had not written anything in the composition notebook, which was no longer present. There was nothing in the room or the house that clarified anything. His face, Ruth Kavanagh said, was composed, not peaceful exactly. She resisted that word, she said, because she felt it was too easy and too final. Composed, she said, was the right word, like a piece of music that has come to its last measure. Fact 17. The last and most persistent question in the story of Thomas Aldren is not what he saw in the Argonne forest in September of 1918. That question is real, and it is important, and it will never be answered. But it is not the question that has followed those who have studied this case most closely. The question that follows them is simpler and more uncomfortable. It is this: having survived, having come home, having lived for 30 years in a community of people who cared for him and worried about him and tried in their limited ways to reach him. Why did Thomas Aldren choose, if it was a choice, to keep his silence? Not as a symptom to be treated, not as a wound to be healed, but as something he maintained and inhabited, with a consistency that could only be called deliberate, something he nurtured across decades with the same care and the same precision with which he had once moved small pins across a map of a war that had not yet arrived. The orderly's letter suggests he was capable of speech, at least once, at least in the immediate aftermath of whatever had happened. The nodding to Ruth Kavanaugh's question suggests that some capacity for basic communication persisted to the end. The lip movements in the evenings, the silent singing, suggest an interior life that had not gone dark. The composition notebook, the careful placement of his belongings before he died, these suggest intention, agency, an organized relationship to his own experience. He had not lost language. He had put it down. The question is whether he put it down because what he had seen was inexpressible, because no combination of words in any human tongue could carry the weight of it across the distance between his interior and the comprehension of another person, or whether he put it down because he had made a calculation with the strange cold logic of a man who has been altered by extremity into something more precise and more austere than ordinary human psychology, that the world would be better served by his silence than by his speech. Dr. Hartwell, in the conclusion of her clinical paper, wrote something that has been quoted by every researcher who has subsequently worked on this case, and it is worth ending here with her words, paraphrased but close. She wrote that in her clinical experience, the most extreme cases of post-traumatic mutism were not at their core cases of communication failure. They were cases of communication refusal. The patients who refused to speak were not patients who had forgotten how to carry meaning. They were patients who had decided, at some level below conscious deliberation, that meaning itself was not safe to carry, that to describe what they knew was to make it portable, to put it into the world's hands, and that the world's hands in their assessment were not ready to hold it. Thomas Aldren came home silent and stayed that way for 30 years. He watched the town go about its life. He walked its streets in the mornings. He sat in its church on Sunday evenings. He watched Eleanor Marsh marry another man. He watched his parents grow old and die. He watched the Depression arrive and the Second War begin and the world remake itself and continue unmaking itself in the ways that worlds do. And through all of it he carried, in that absolute silence, in that still and steady body, whatever he had found in a stone barn 4 kilometers behind the front line of the Argonne forest on a September night in 1918. He never gave it to us. Perhaps he was protecting us. Perhaps he was protecting himself. Perhaps by the end, after 30 years of keeping it, the silence had become indistinguishable from the thing it was keeping, and to break one would have been to destroy the other. The river in Harwick Falls still ices over most winters, though the ironworks closed decades ago, and the town is smaller now and quieter. The house above the former hardware store is still standing. The room where Thomas Aldren was born, and where he died, looks north toward the hills. On clear mornings, the window catches the light early. Whatever he saw in those hills, whatever found him in that silent forest, in the dark, in the days when the world was breaking apart, it went with him, and the question of what it was will outlast every attempt to answer it.